Claire Harrison had beauty, success, and a seemingly perfect marriage to millionaire real estate mogul Daniel Harrison, but behind closed doors, their love was a ticking time bomb. When Daniel discovered her secret life back in London, the man who had everything chose the one thing he couldn't control: murder. To the outside world, Daniel and Claire Harrison were the picture of elegance and success. Their wedding had made headlines in Miami's social pages and even drew interest from tabloids in London. Daniel, confident, tall and polished, owned a luxury real estate firm that catered to celebrities and international investors. Claire, with her graceful poise and soft British accent, had just launched her own high-end fashion label. Together, they were magnetic. Strangers admired them, friends envied them, but perfection, as always, was only surface deep. They met at an art gallery in Los Angeles during Fashion Week. Claire was showcasing pieces from her debut collection. Daniel was attending on behalf of a client. Their eyes met across the crowd, and what followed felt at first like a movie script. Weekend trips to the Hamptons, private jets to the Amalfi Coast, romantic dinners under chandeliers. Everything about their courtship was fast, expensive, and intoxicating. Within 6 months, they were married on the cliffs of Big Sur, vows exchanged under a pale orange sunset, while guests sipped champagne flown in from France. But somewhere inside that fairy tale, something small but critical had started to unravel. Daniel began to notice Claire growing more distant, even during moments that were supposed to be intimate. Her gaze lingered too long on her phone. She smiled politely, but never deeply. At first he told himself it was stress. After all, launching a fashion brand was no small feat, but he couldn't ignore the growing ache in his chest every time she chose silence over conversation. He had built a world where he could control everything: investments, deals, image, but Claire's emotions didn't follow the rules. That unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Claire, on her part, felt suffocated. At first, she had been swept away by Daniel's charisma and power. She liked the way he walked into rooms as if he owned them, and how he made her feel like the most desired woman in the world. But as time passed, she began to see through the illusion. Daniel wasn't simply confident, he was possessive. Everything had to look perfect. Every moment was curated for show. He commented on what she wore, who she talked to, how much she smiled. At events, he would place a hand on the small of her back, not lovingly, but as if to say, "She's mine." The truth was, Claire was lonely. Her career, once a source of joy, now felt like a trophy Daniel used to display his own success. She missed London, its gray skies, its honest people, its silence. In Miami, everything felt too bright, too artificial. She began visiting home more often under the pretense of work, needing space to remember who she was before her life became a brand. Daniel noticed these trips. Each one chipped away at his pride. He told himself he trusted her, but deep down, there was a cold flame of suspicion growing in his stomach. He would lie awake at night while she packed, rehearsing questions he never asked. "Why London again? Who's meeting you there?" But he swallowed his fears because confrontation meant risk, and he didn't want to risk the illusion they had worked so hard to create. And yet, beneath the cold, a part of him loved her. Perhaps not in the way she needed, but in the only way he knew. She was the crown jewel of his empire, and the thought of losing her filled him with something far more dangerous than heartbreak: humiliation. Claire, meanwhile, couldn't help but feel that the life she had chosen was slowly becoming a cage. She told herself she could endure it, that Daniel would change, that success required sacrifice. But each time she smiled for a photo or held his hand in public, something inside her cracked a little more. The world saw a couple built on love and wealth. But in truth, Daniel and Claire were already strangers. One clung to control, the other to freedom. And though neither of them knew it yet, something irreversible had already begun. London always felt like breathing again. The moment Claire stepped off the plane and into the gray, rain-soaked air, she felt something inside her relax, something that had been tight and coiled for too long. The sound of taxi horns, the smell of damp stone, even the coldness of strangers brushing past. It was all familiar. It was hers. Here she wasn't Daniel Harrison's wife. She wasn't someone's possession, someone's brand, someone's perfect partner in a glossy world. She was just Claire. The girl who used to sit in cafes sketching dress silhouettes on napkins. The woman who once believed love didn't have to mean giving yourself up entirely. Her flat in Chelsea was modest by her husband's standards. 2 bedrooms, minimal decor, soft wood floors. But it was her sanctuary. She had rented it under her maiden name, using money from an account Daniel didn't know existed. She told herself it was for convenience, for work, but somewhere deep down, she knew it was more than that. It was a quiet rebellion. A quiet preparation for something she still didn't have the courage to admit. Adam Turner was never part of the plan. He came back into her life when she least expected it, after photographing her first collection nearly a year ago. Back then, it was all business. He was charming, but professional. Funny, but never inappropriate. But there had been something in the way he saw her, not just through his camera lens, but really saw her, that had stuck with her. And when she saw him again in London at a gallery event, the connection returned without permission. It started as coffee. It became dinner. Then long walks after midnight, when the streets were quiet, and they could pretend, just for a few hours, that their lives were simpler. Adam made her laugh, not the polite, performative kind of laughter she used with Daniel, but real, stupid, unexpected laughter that made her feel human again. She didn't hunt to fall for him, but it was as if she'd been walking through fog for years, and he was the first person who actually looked at her and said, "Are you lost?" She hadn't told Adam the full story. Not yet. He didn't know about the surveillance. The subtle control. The way Daniel could turn cold behind closed doors if she didn't smile the right way or say the right thing at the right moment. She didn't want Adam to pity her. She just wanted to remember what it felt like to be wanted without condition. Back in Miami, Daniel sat in his office, staring at a series of grainy photos. Claire's hand brushing Adam's arm. Their faces close in dim lighting. A kiss at her flat doorstep. His stomach churned, not with sadness, but with something darker. So this is who she becomes when she thinks no one is watching. He felt played. Humiliated. After everything he'd given her, after sculpting the perfect life, the perfect narrative, she had turned him into a fool, and not just any fool. A fool in front of investors, followers, friends. That kind of betrayal wasn't personal. It was an attack. It was a threat to his name, his control, his image. The part of him that had once loved her flickered briefly, then vanished behind the rage. He didn't confront her. Not yet. He smiled when they talked on the phone, asked about her meetings, pretended he wasn't reading every message, tracking every movement. He needed more than fury. He needed a plan, because if she was building a life in secret, then she would need to be reminded violently, if necessary, that she was not the one in control. Claire, across the ocean, sensed none of this. Or maybe she did and ignored it. Maybe there was a part of her that knew the rope she was walking had already begun to fray. But for now, she let herself enjoy the illusion. She let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she could still escape. Neither of them realized how close they already were to the point of no return. Daniel watched the snow fall through the wide glass windows of the Aspen chalet, his hand resting around a tumbler of scotch that had long since gone warm. Claire stood across the room, her arms wrapped around herself, as if she were trying to hold something inside from spilling out. The fire crackled between them, filling the silence with a comforting sound that neither of them felt. He had invited her under the guise of healing. A winter getaway, just the two of them. The kind of romantic escape people in troubled marriages were supposed to try before giving up. Claire had hesitated when he suggested it, but something in her softened. Guilt, perhaps, or maybe the part of her that still remembered the man she first met before the control, before the coldness, before she stopped recognizing herself in their wedding photos. She had said yes, and that yes would cost her everything. Daniel had staged the perfect setting. A secluded chalet, the mountains majestic, the snow thick and white and unmarked. Gourmet meals, silk robes, slow music. He played the part of the devoted husband so well that even Claire began to question her instincts. Maybe she had overreacted. Maybe Daniel did love her. Maybe this was what healing looked like. But when she caught him watching her with eyes that didn't match his words, sharp, calculating, too still, her doubts crept back in like frost under a locked door. He noticed every movement she made, every breath, every flick of her eyes toward the phone she kept hidden in the lining of her coat. She tried to act normal, casual, but her fingers trembled when she texted. He knew she was still in contact with the man in London, the one who had dared to occupy a place that was his. Daniel hadn't confronted her, not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. Not about her heart, about control, about appearances, about ownership. Earlier that afternoon, Claire had stepped out under the pretense of a walk, wrapped in a soft gray scarf and snow boots. Daniel had watched her from the upstairs window, his face a blank mask. He didn't follow her, not physically. He didn't need to. The tracker app on his phone lit up with her location, showing her paused near a wooded ridge, far from any hiking path. She was alone, but she spoke softly, and when Daniel listened to the recording through the hacked mic on her phone, her words sliced through him like ice. She said she was leaving him, that she didn't care about the money anymore, that she was tired of pretending. She told Adam she would come back to London and finally file the paperwork, that she wasn't scared anymore. Daniel's hands had gone still. He didn't feel rage. Not immediately. What he felt was silence, an eerie, deadly quiet inside his chest. The kind of stillness right before an avalanche. That night, he cooked dinner, lit candles, played her favorite music. He poured wine with a smile and listened as she talked about possibly designing a winter line. He even laughed when she made a joke. But inside he was calculating the weight of things, the distance between the fire poker and the wine glasses, the softness of the rug, how loud the wind was outside. Claire looked at him, uncertain. There was something in his calm that didn't feel safe. She couldn't explain it, but a knot tightened in her stomach, and her fingers brushed her phone instinctively. Daniel didn't blink. He simply leaned forward, smiled and said, "You're not going anywhere." Claire, not out loud, just in his mind, over and over, like a prayer. And that night, while snow blanketed the mountains and the wind howled through the trees, something shifted forever. One heart beating faster, another growing colder. A silence fell over the chalet, thick, final, and far too quiet for two people who were supposed to be in love. 3 days later, Claire was gone. Daniel stood in front of the massive stone fireplace in the Aspen chalet, a wool sweater pulled tight over his chest as he gave a carefully measured statement to the police. He told them she had gone for a morning hike alone, something she often did to clear her head, and never returned. He sounded distraught, yet composed, concerned, but not frantic, just enough emotion to seem genuine but not so much that it would invite suspicion. The officers nodded sympathetically, took his statement, and left to organize a search. Outside, the forest was quiet and unmarked, heavy with snow that had fallen overnight, the kind that buried tracks, covered mistakes, erased timelines. Daniel had counted on that. For the first few days, he played the grieving husband with perfect precision. He joined the search parties, called her friends, made pleas to the media with a carefully cracked voice. People believed him. Why wouldn't they? He had money, reputation, charm. Who would ever suspect the loving husband? But the truth was buried under a thin crust of ice and soil, halfway down a wooded slope behind the chalet. Claire's body lay beneath a pile of rocks and snow, her face hidden by the designer scarf she had once draped over herself so casually. Her skull bore a single deep wound. It had been fast, merciful, in some twisted way, not born of rage but of control, cold, calculated, fine. In the days that followed, Daniel returned to the chalet alone. He sat by the fire, scrolling through old photos of the two of them, He knew what the world saw, a man clinging to memories. But in truth, he was studying his own story, making sure everything lined up, every timestamp, every camera, every shred of digital trail. He wiped her phone clean, smashed her hidden backup device, buried her handbag a mile away. He was thorough. He always had been. But even the most perfect plans have flaws. 2 weeks after her disappearance, a search dog caught a faint scent near the slope behind the chalet. It was weak, nearly lost beneath the layers of snow and time, but persistent. And then, they found her. The discovery sent shockwaves through the media. Claire Harrison, rising star of fashion, social media darling, wife of millionaire real estate mogul, was dead. News outlets flooded the airwaves with glossy pictures of her smile, her elegance, her seemingly perfect life. Daniel held a press conference the next day. He wore black, his eyes rimmed red, his voice shaking just enough. "I loved her more than anything," he said, staring into the camera. "She was my world." But in the privacy of the chalet, Daniel felt nothing. He thought it was over, that the story was written, the tragedy complete. But the investigators weren't finished. There were things they noticed, things Daniel had overlooked. The absence of footprints near where the body was found, curious for someone who was supposedly hiking, the lack of snow in her lungs, which contradicted the idea of her being caught in a storm, the fire poker, missing from the set by the hearth, and then the blood, a faint stain in the storage room, nearly invisible under dim light, but not invisible to forensic luminol. They hadn't confronted him yet, not directly, but he could feel the shift in their tone when they called. The questions had changed. The pauses were longer. He recognized suspicion when he heard it. Back in London, Claire's sister was pushing for answers. Her voice, once quiet, was now broadcast across international media. "Claire wouldn't just go hiking alone in the snow," she said. "Something's wrong. He's lying." Daniel watched it all unfold from his high-rise office in Miami, fingers drumming against the glass. He had planned everything. He had controlled the narrative. But control, he was starting to realize, was slippery. And the truth, like a body buried in snow, never stays hidden forever. The illusion was unraveling. What Daniel once believed to be a flawless narrative, a wife who disappeared on a morning hike, a grieving husband left behind, was beginning to collapse under the weight of facts he hadn't anticipated. Each day brought a new thread pulled loose, and no matter how tightly he tried to control it, the story was fraying. He sat alone in his Miami office, the blinds drawn despite the bright Florida sun pressing against the windows. His phone vibrated softly beside him, but he didn't answer. The calls were always the same now. Detectives with carefully neutral voices, reporters fishing for statements, lawyers asking if there was anything he'd like to share. He ignored them all. Silence was safer. But silence couldn't cover evidence. The investigators had returned to the chalet, combing over every inch of the property with a fine-tooth approach they hadn't used before. Claire's smartwatch had been recovered among her belongings, overlooked in the initial search, tucked inside the lining of her travel bag. When they powered it on, it told a story that didn't match Daniel's. It hadn't tracked any walking activity the morning Claire supposedly left for her hike. No steps, no elevation changes. Nothing after 2. But what it did show was even more damning. At 2:36 a.m., her heart rate spiked suddenly, rapidly, consistent with fear, panic, or pain. Less than 5 minutes later, it stopped. No recovery, no movement, just a flat line. Claire hadn't gone hiking that morning. She had died hours earlier, inside the chalet, while Daniel claimed he had been asleep, while he said she'd kissed him goodbye. The blood found near the fire poker had come back from the lab, a perfect match to Claire's DNA. A silent witness he thought he'd erased, and the missing poker, gone, vanished, as if it had never existed. Then there were the financials. Investigators subpoenaed bank records and trust documents. That's when they discovered Claire's quiet rebellion, how she had transferred the majority of their shared funds into a private UK trust 6 weeks before her death. She was preparing to leave him, not just emotionally but financially. If she had filed for divorce, Daniel would have lost everything. He had no access to the London-based assets, no claim to the royalties from her fashion label. Claire had made sure of it, and in doing so she'd made herself a threat. The motive was no longer speculative. It was obvious: greed, control, fear of public humiliation. Daniel still refused to admit anything, even as his lawyers grew distant, even as friends stopped calling, even as the media began to shift its tone from sympathy to suspicion, from heartbreak to horror. He kept telling himself he could manage this, that he could twist the narrative again, like he always had. But he was tired. At night he sat by himself in the corner of his penthouse living room, the city lights of Miami flickering outside like artificial stars. He no longer drank, he didn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Claire's face, not how she looked in the photographs, but how she had looked in that final moment, when realization bloomed in her eyes. That quiet understanding that he wasn't going to let her leave. That love had long since been replaced by ownership. He saw her fall again and again in his mind, not out of rage, but out of some twisted need to keep his world intact. It hadn't felt like murder at the time. It had felt like order, like control. But now, all he could feel was the echo of that silence. The moment the fire poker slipped from his hand, the thud of her body against the stone, the wind howling outside like it already knew what he'd done. And still, he told himself, you had no choice. But deep down, Daniel knew he did. He just couldn't stand the thought of losing. Not to her, not to anyone. Now the walls were closing in, not fast, not loud, but steady, like footsteps in fresh snow, coming closer with each breath. Daniel barely looked up when the knock came. The sound echoed through the quiet villa in Nassau, where he had fled 2 weeks earlier, claiming he needed time to grieve in peace. He'd chosen the Bahamas because it was familiar, isolated and expensive, just the right place to stay out of reach while pretending he wasn't running. But the knock wasn't from room service or a sympathetic friend. It was slow, deliberate, firm. And it told him the moment he'd been dreading had finally arrived. When the door opened, he didn't resist. He didn't argue, didn't protest, didn't ask what this was about. He simply stood there in his linen shirt and bare feet, silent as the officers stepped in, placed him in cuffs, and read him his rights. The words washed over him like a dream, surreal but distant. He didn't feel panic. Not yet. What he felt was something colder: resignation. Somewhere inside he had known this was inevitable. The truth always had sharp edges, and now they were cutting through what little control he had left. The extradition to the UK was fast, almost too fast. Claire had maintained dual residency, and her legal team had already been building a case with British prosecutors. Daniel didn't speak during the flight. His lawyers had advised silence, and for once, he obeyed. He stared out the window at the clouds, white and soft and meaningless, as the world he built slowly collapsed beneath him. In London, the courtroom was cold in every way. Grey walls, stern faces, cameras flashing outside like lightning. Claire's family filled the front row, her mother's lips tight with fury, her sister's hands clenched around a tissue. Adam Turner wasn't there. His absence was a quiet mystery, but no one seemed surprised. He had vanished from the public eye, choosing to grieve privately, far from the circus. Daniel sat in the defendant's box wearing a suit he hadn't picked, his wrists faintly bruised from the flight's restraints. He didn't speak as the prosecution laid out the timeline, the hacked phone, the financial records, the deleted GPS history, the blood near the hearth. They played the data from Claire's smartwatch in the silent courtroom, letting the heart monitor's final rhythm echo into the stillness. What killed Claire wasn't just a blow to the head, they said. It was a man's refusal to be humiliated. A man's belief that control meant love, that ownership could replace trust. A man who watched her slip away and decided if he couldn't have her, no one would. Daniel stared straight ahead. He didn't cry. He didn't flinch. He was still trying to hold on to the image he'd created. Sharp suit, clean lines, expression unreadable, but no one was buying it anymore. The defense attempted to shift the story. They hinted at mental health issues, implied the blow might have been unintentional, a tragic accident in the heat of emotion. But the prosecution destroyed that narrative with one quiet, brutal truth. Daniel didn't call for help. He didn't bury her with care. He erased her, like a blemish on his reputation. When the verdict came in, it was unanimous. Guilty of murder, tampering with evidence, obstruction of justice. Life in prison with no possibility of parole. For the first time, Daniel blinked. He didn't stand. He didn't argue. He only lowered his head slightly, like a man watching the curtain fall on a play he didn't realize was already over. In the crowd, Claire's mother began to cry, not with sadness but with relief. Her daughter's voice had been silenced, but justice had finally spoken for her. And Daniel, the man who once controlled everything, the headlines, the image, the story, was no longer the narrator. He was just another criminal in a jumpsuit, a hollow echo of the man he once pretended to be. The world moved on, but not completely. Claire's death had stunned the public. Her elegance, her success, the tragedy of it all. But stories, even the most heartbreaking ones, eventually fade from headlines. The news cycle replaced her with fresher scandals, newer victims, louder noise. Still, for those closest to her, the grief remained, quietly reshaping their lives long after the cameras stopped flashing. Daniel was transferred to a high-security prison in northern England, where time crawled forward like a punishment in itself. The silence that once empowered him now became unbearable. Gone were the curated dinners, the luxury walls, the loyal staff. Now it was metal bars and routine, the constant echo of other inmates, the endless gray. He had been a man who controlled every room he entered. Now he couldn't even choose when to eat. At night, he lay on the stiff cot, staring at the ceiling, haunted not by guilt, but by something worse, irrelevance. He was no longer feared or admired. He was forgotten. A man reduced to a case file, a courtroom memory, a face people pointed to in documentaries. His name still trended from time to time, attached to clips of Claire's smile, to pundits debating how love could turn so fatal. But no one cared what Daniel thought anymore. His voice, once so carefully measured, had lost its power. And yet, he often imagined her. Claire. Not the version from the wedding photos or fashion shoots, but the one who sat across from him at dinner on that last night, her eyes flickering with doubt. He could still feel the way her presence filled a room, the quiet strength she carried, the subtle defiance she thought he didn't notice. He hated her for trying to leave him, but some nights in the stillness of his cell, he missed her in a way that twisted inside his chest, not out of love, but out of possession. She was the one thing he couldn't erase. Meanwhile, in London, the foundation launched in Claire's name began to grow. Her sister Amelia poured herself into it with a kind of desperate devotion, using the work to cope, to survive, to create something meaningful out of the ashes. The Claire Foundation supported women in emotionally manipulative or financially abusive relationships, ones that didn't always leave bruises but left scars all the same. Donations came in from around the world. Survivors reached out with letters, stories. In giving Claire's name a legacy, Amelia found purpose, but the grief never really lifted. Some mornings Amelia would wake up still expecting a message, a call, a laugh from across the kitchen table. She'd forget, for just a moment, that Claire was gone. And when she remembered, it hit like a wave that never weakened. The pain dulled with time, but it never disappeared. She'd lost a sister, a best friend, a piece of her own identity. As for Adam Turner, he vanished from public life completely. He deleted his social media, canceled exhibitions, refused all interviews. Rumors swirled. Some said he'd moved to the countryside. Others whispered he had gone abroad. No one knew for sure, but those close to him said he never truly recovered. The guilt he carried, though undeserved, weighed heavy. He had loved Claire quietly, respectfully, with a kind of tenderness that never got to bloom. She died before they could begin anything real. That haunted him more than words could capture. The story of Claire and Daniel Harrison became the subject of documentaries, podcasts, true crime panels. Her name was spoken with sadness, his with disgust. But beyond all that, there were still the quiet, personal echoes. A scent, a dress, a favorite song playing unexpectedly in a cafe. Claire lived on in fragments, etched into the people who had truly known her, and forever out of reach for the man who thought she would never leave. Because in the end, Claire had left him. Not with a suitcase or a legal document, but with something far more lasting. She left him with the truth.